I am presenting Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 3, Sunday, June 14th, 2026. The lesson is entitled, God Renews His Covenant. Lesson text comes from Exodus chapter 34, verses 1 through 14. Related scriptures are Exodus 32, 1 through 6, and 15 through 35, Nehemiah 9, 1 through 25, Deuteronomy 5, 1 through 10, 7, 1 through 11, Judges 1, 27 through 2, 5. The place is Mount Sinai. The time is 1445 BC. In the first lesson of the quarter, we saw how God's patience with us means He has a reason to be patient, and we ought not to delay in repenting. In today's lesson, we find a similar truth. While Moses was on Mount Sinai receiving the commandments of God, the Israelites were rebelling against God. Even though they had heard God's voice speaking the 10 commandments, Exodus 21 through 21, they quickly broke His commandments by creating an idol to worship. Instead of destroying the entire nation, God revealed His character of perfect justice and perfect mercy by showing Moses His glory and making a covenant with His people. Today's aim, facts. To know what happened when God revealed His name to Moses. Principle, to understand that God is both merciful and just. Application, to trust in God and obey His commandments. Illustrating the lesson. The commandments God revealed to Moses showed His character, and His character has not changed. Even though we are in a new covenant under Jesus, we still need to obey the commandments God has given us to love Him and to love others. Practical points. 1. God gives second chances even though sinners die in His presence apart from His mercy. Exodus 34, 1 through 3. 2. A true servant of God follows all His instructions precisely. Exodus 34, 4, Hebrews 3, 1. 3. To imitate God's character, we must prioritize compassion over judgment. Exodus 34, 5 through 7. 4. Our prayers should stem from worship and be rooted in God's promises, verses 8 through 9. 5. We have no power in ourselves to gain victory over spiritual enemies. God alone defeats them on our behalf. Verses 10 through 11. 6. God expects His people to be fully committed to Him, actively ridding themselves of anything that competes for our worship. Verses 12 through 14. Golden text. And the Lord passed by before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth. Exodus 34, 6. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is a second chance. Exodus 34, 1 through 4. The second is the Lord's mercy in the renewed covenant, Exodus 34, 5 through 9. And the third is the Lord's jealousy in the renewed covenant, Exodus 34, 10 through 14. Introduction. Last week we saw Moses' plea for mercy after Israel refused to enter the promised land. This week we study an earlier event when the Lord mercifully renewed the covenant after the people worshiped the golden calf. Even when His people sinned, the Lord was bountiful in mercy. At first glance, Exodus 34, 1 through 14 may seem to present contradictory aspects of God's character. On the one hand, God declared himself merciful, gracious, and forgiving, verses 6 through 7. But on the other hand, he identified himself as a jealous God who would execute judgment on the guilty, verses 7 and 14. We will see, however, that those aspects of God's character contribute to God's goal of establishing a personal relationship with his people. A second chance, Exodus 34:1. And the Lord said unto Moses, Hew thee 2 tables of stone like unto the first, and I will write upon these tables the words that were in the first tables which thou breakest. Verse 2. And be ready in the morning, and come up in the morning unto Mount Sinai, and present thyself there to me in the top of the mount. Verse 3. And no man shall come up with thee, neither let any man be seen throughout all the mount, neither let the flocks nor herds feed before that mount. Verse 4. And he hewed 2 tables of stone like unto the first. And Moses rose up early in the morning and went up unto Mount Sinai. And the Lord had commanded him, and took in his hand the 2 tables of stones. The Lord's commandments, Exodus 34:1 through 3. After the golden calf incident, Moses angrily shamed the 2 tablets of the covenant God had just given him on Mount Sinai, 32:19. The broken stones reflected the broken covenant between the Lord and Israel. Even so, after urgent intercession by Moses, the Lord determined to repair his covenant with Israel. Just as Moses' breaking of the original tablets had represented the breaking of the covenant, so the Lord commanded Moses to bring 2 new tablets to represent his renewal. The Lord's commands paralleled the first giving of the covenant. Both times, the ceremony occurred in the morning, 19:16, 34:2. Both times, the Lord urged the recipients to be ready, 19:11, 15, 34:2. And both times the Lord emphasized that no people or animals could touch the mountain or they would die, 19:12 through 13, 34:3. At the covenant renewal, that last command was even stricter. Aaron had been allowed to go part way up the mountain with Moses at the first ceremony, 19:24, and the people had observed from the base of the mountain, verse 11. But now, no people or animals were even allowed to show their faces near the mountain, 34:3. Perhaps that reflected the distance the people had put between themselves and their holy God when they turned to idolatry with the golden calf. One other similarity between the first and second ceremonies was God's promise to write the commandments with his own finger, 34:1, 31:18. It may be confusing then when 34:27 says that Moses wrote down God's words. There are a few possible explanations for this seeming discrepancy. The text could simply be equating what Moses wrote with what God wrote. This would align with Moses' role as a prophet whose words can legitimately be identified as the words of God himself, 7:1 through 2. It is also possible that God wrote out the 10 commandments while Moses wrote out the rest of the commandments he received. This accords with what seems to have happened at the first ceremony when God gave the 10 commandments directly to Israel, chapter 20, but then privately gave a series of case laws for Moses to relay to the people, chapters 21 through 23. Moses' obedience, Exodus 34:4. Moses obeyed God's instructions in every detail, verses 2 through 4. Just as God commanded, Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the first ones and went up in the morning to Mount Sinai. The text includes a refrain often repeated throughout the Pentateuch, as the Lord had commanded him, Exodus 40:32, Leviticus 8:4. That single repeated phrase validates the summary statement about Moses in Hebrews 3:2, that he was faithful in all God's house. We know Moses was imperfect, but he was also faithful to the Lord. In contrast to the faithless Israelites who quickly cast aside the words of God when they worshiped the golden calf, Moses carefully followed all God's instructions. The Lord's mercy in the renewed covenant, verse 5. And the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord, verse 6. And the Lord passed by before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth. Verse 7, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon the children's children unto the third and to the fourth generation. Verse 8. And Moses made haste and bowed his head toward the earth and worshiped. Verse 9. And he said, if now I have found grace in thy sight, O Lord, let my Lord, I pray thee, go among us, for it is a stiff-necked people, and pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for thine inheritance. The Lord's proclamation, Exodus 34:5 through 7. As Moses went up to the mountain, verse 4, the Lord came down to meet him, verse 5, signifying the distance between heaven and earth that the covenant was connecting. The Lord appeared in a cloud, as he did whenever he spoke with Moses in the tent of meeting, 33:9. In Exodus 33:19, the Lord had promised to proclaim his name to Moses, which he hinted was associated with his grace and mercy. Now he fulfilled that promise. The text first states that the Lord proclaimed the name of Yahweh, the Lord's covenant name, in 34:5. It then goes on to flesh out the content of that proclamation in verses 6 through 7. The name or identity of Yahweh then is equivalent to the attributes described in those verses. This was God's condensed description of his full identity, making it one of the most significant passages in the Old Testament. Other Old Testament writers affirm that significance by their many quotations and allusions to the passage. Nehemiah 9:17, Psalms 103:8. At least 3 noteworthy considerations jump out when we read this list of God's characteristics. First, the emphasis is on God's mercy. God used different descriptors to refer to his nature: merciful, gracious, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth, and forgiving. God's loving kindness or steadfast love frequently appears in the context of covenants, which has led some to translate it as covenant love or covenant faithfulness. Second, the last characteristic does not seem to belong with the others, but it is essential to understand who God is. After the long list of descripting God's merciful nature, it may be surprising to read God's commitment to judging the guilty. To many, such an idea is offensive. If God is love, why would he judge anyone? Yet, if we stop for a moment and think about what a world without judgment would look like, we would see the necessity of that characteristic in God. For example, do we really want murderers, child molesters, and sex traffickers to roam freely without any repercussions? Our problem with judgment arises when we recognize that everyone, including us, is guilty and deserving of judgment. That brings us to the third point. Even though the description ends on a note of judgment, it does not present God's judgment as equal to his forgiveness. The judgment lasts for only 3 to 4 generations against those who hate the Lord. Exodus 25. God's covenant love, however, lasts for thousands of generations for those who love him. Although we know from other passages that God judges and forgives people on an individual basis, independent of what their parents did, Ezekiel 18, the reference to future generations tapped into a key aspect of God's covenant relationship with his people. Nearly every time the Lord made a covenant in the Old Testament, he specified that the covenant was with an individual and his descendants. That was the case for his covenants with Noah, Genesis 9:9, Abraham 12:7, 15:13, Isaac 22:17 through 18, Jacob 28:13 through 14, and David, 2 Samuel 7:12. Even the new covenant carries a blessing for believers' descendants, Acts 2:38 through 39. The point in Exodus 34:7 is not that the next 4 generations of a wicked family will never receive mercy. The point is the contrast between God's brief anger and his everlasting covenant love. Moses' response, Exodus 34:8 through 9. Moses reverently bowed at God's revelation. His worship turned to another petition that the Lord would forgive Israel and send his presence with them. Although Moses had already made a similar request and the Lord had agreed, Moses now appealed to him based on the words God had just spoken. He asked to find favor or grace in God's eyes using the same Hebrew root word that describes God as gracious in verse 6. He also asked the Lord to pardon Israel's sins using 2 of the 3 terms for sin from verse 7. Based on God's grace and forgiveness, Moses wanted the Lord to take possession of Israel or take Israel as the Lord's inheritance. Previously, the word for take possession or inherit described Israel taking of the land of promise, 23:30, 32:13. Most important, Israel would remain the property or inheritance of the Lord. The Lord's jealousy in the renewed covenant, verse 10. And he said, behold, I will make a covenant before all thy people. I will do marvels such as have not been done in all the earth, nor in any nation, and all the people among which thou art shall see the work of the Lord. For it is a terrible thing that I will do with thee. Verse 11. Observe thou that which I command thee this day. Behold, I drive out before thee the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Prezerite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Verse 12. Take heed to thyself, lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land whither thou goest, lest it be for a snare in the midst of thee. Verse 13. But ye shall destroy their altars, break their images, and cut down their groves. Verse 14. For thou shalt worship no other God, for the Lord whose name is jealous is a jealous God. The Lord's victory, Exodus 34:10. God answered Moses' request by declaring that he was making a covenant before all the people of Israel. The heart of God's covenant with Israel was that he would be their God and they would be his people, and that he would dwell among them. Exodus 29:45 through 46, Leviticus 26:12. Therefore, by renewing his commitment to that covenant, the Lord was essentially granting Moses' request for him to take possession of Israel as his own people and to go in their midst. God then promised to drive out the Canaanites so that Israel could possess their land. That statement seems to reflect God's covenant with Abraham more than his covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai, Genesis 12:7. God's covenant in the Old Testament are not disconnected from one another. His covenants through Moses and David drove forward the goal of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And all the Old Testament covenants pointed forward to the new covenant, which would fulfill all the promises. 2 Corinthians 1:20. God said he would create marvels or wonders on behalf of Israel. Exodus 34:10. Using the same word that described the plagues on Egypt in 3:20. He would not merely do these wonders, he would create them just as he had created the universe. By using the word for create, the Hebrew word bara, an action attributed only to God in the Old Testament. God emphasized the miraculous nature of what he would do and the necessity of his action. No human could do what he was going to do. He would be the one driving out the Canaanites, not the Israelites. Exodus 23:28, Deuteronomy 7:20, Joshua 24:12. The Lord's expectations, Exodus 34:11 through 14. God also set expectations for Israel's role in the conquest of the land. They were to guard or observe certain commands, verse 11. Although the first overt command comes in verse 12, the first thing they were to observe was the statement in verse 11 that God would drive out the people before them. They may not sound like much of a command, but it was disobedience to that command that kept the first generation of Israelites out of the promised land. As we read last week, they did not believe God could give them victory over the Canaanites, so they rebelled against Moses and forfeited their right to enter the land. Numbers 14:1 through 23. God also gave the Israelites specific instructions on how to avoid idolatry once they were in the land. This was especially relevant given their immediate fall into idolatry after the first giving of the 10 Commandments. The Lord gave Israel one action to avoid and one action to pursue. They were to avoid making covenants with anyone else in the land. Their one covenant was with God, and any other covenant would inevitably compromise them and become a stumbling block for them. At the same time, they were to actively seek out all the worship structures in the land and destroy them. God did not give these commands with an arbitrary prejudice. He gave them so that the land would forever be rid of wicked practices like child sacrifice, witchcraft, adultery, and incest. Leviticus 21 through 23. And so that Israel would remain his treasured possession. Deuteronomy 7:1 through 6. Ultimately, those reasons fall under one overarching reason: the Lord's jealousy. He knew that any influence from the Canaanites would lead Israel to worship other gods. Like a marriage contract, Israel's covenant with the Lord was exclusive. Worship of any other god constituted spiritual adultery. That is why God depicted himself as jealous, even declaring that his name already defined in Exodus 34, 6 through 7 as gracious and forgiving is jealous. Verse 14. God is deeply rational and never gives up on his people. Verses 6 through 7 expresses that truth by depicting God as one who gives second chances and always remains faithful to those on whom he sets his love. Verse 14 expresses the same truth by depicting him as a jealous husband who pursues reconciliation with his bride. God's jealousy should motivate faithfulness to him, and it should also be a great comfort. He will not simply let his people slip away into idolatry. He will fight for them, forgive them, and restore them. Questions. 1. What did Moses do after Israel worshiped the golden calf? 2. How was the covenant renewal stricter than the first giving of the covenant? 3. What phrase repeated several times in the Pentateuch is promisement in this account? 4. What did the Lord do as Moses climbed the mountain? 5. What makes Exodus 34, 5 through 9 one of the most significant passages in the Old Testament? 6. What is emphasized in the list of God's characteristics? 7. What is the point of mentioning the third and fourth generation, Exodus 34, 7? 8. What were the grounds of Moses' request? 9. What was the heart of God's covenant with Israel? 10. How was Israel called to avoid idolatry? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, June 14, 2026. Please remember to click the subscribe tab. God bless.